Work assignment. Work assignment is a process of assigning work to the project team following the project plans. For that, you're going to need team calendars. We're going to look at RACI Matrix, work assignment sheets, and resource charts. Here's a moment that once your team is ready and you have all the plans approved and you are ready to start assigning work so that the team can do all the work plans that we have developed in the previous phase. So make sure that in this stage, when you're starting to assign work to the team, that you have some basic information, and we're going to look at some of those techniques to make sure that you have the teams and they have the work and they are able to deliver that according to the plans. The first level of information that you need is called the team calendars. Here's where we take note of all the vacations and any other events that are used in the assignment of the work to the team. So for each one of your team members, you need to ask them their selection of dates when they're going to be taking vacations or they are not going to be available for any reason to work on the project. The idea is that you're able to identify all those times when your team is not going to be working on the project. And some of these are like vacations or time off, but it will give you a good understanding of the time you have available to assign them work. Another good use of this calendar is that it helps you identify that and make sure that not all that your team is not taking vacation at the same time or during a critical moment during the project. The idea is that if you need them to do some specific work, make sure that they are able to reschedule their vacations or their time off so that you have your team or key members of your team available during that time. And this usually is a process of negotiation at the beginning of the year and making sure that people are able to identify the time they're going to be taking vacations or trainings and making sure that you're not missing the whole team during a critical moment in the project. The second tool that we use is the RACI Matrix. That's when we start for each one of the activities in the WBS, we assign one person responsible for that activity. During that process, we also identify the people who authorize the work and the people who contribute to that work. Some of the people are the ones who are informed. What is important is that now we know the people who are going to be responsible for each one of the activities and the people who are going to be also involved in that activity. Then with that information, we need to go to the next step, and that is the understanding of the work assignment. This is a one-page usually document that describes in more detail what is the work that we have assigned to a team member. And you can use a similar template like this one where you have the description of the name of the project, the code of the WBS, and the name of the activity. Then you have a section where you have a detailed description of all the work required, include quality requirements and instructions to complete the work. This is the section where you are explaining what is the work that needs to be done. It doesn't need to be large or too complex, just enough for people to understand what is needed from them. Then you have the name of the person who's responsible for that. Sometimes you might have a unit or department. The date that is assigned, that information from the schedule, and the due date that comes, the information when the activity needs to start and when they should be delivered or when is the due date. If needed, information about the budget, and then resource assigning. This is where you have people who are going to be with the letter C in the RACI Matrix. Those are people who are going to be contributing to this activity, to this work. You also, it's good to include an acceptance criteria. This is related to quality. The idea is that how do we know that we completed this work? How do we know that this work is completed according to the quality specifications that we need? And then the work reviewed by, and here's where we put the letter A. This is the name of the person who in the RACI Matrix was identified as the person who will authorize or accept this work. And the idea is that there is a process of quality review, that one person is responsible for the work, are, and another person is responsible for its acceptance or review. You can also include information about the deliverables of that activity and any assumptions that are linked to this work. Again, this is a 1 or 2 page document that is used to assign work to the different team members. For each one of the WBS, you can then have at the lower level documentation with all the work descriptions on your project. Sometimes in the project management terminology, they are called the WBS dictionary. The idea is that for each element that you have at the lower level, there is a document that has a complete description of what is that activity. Depending again on the level of complexity or risk on your project, the amount of information could be higher or lower. If you know that it's a complex activity that needs a very detailed description, then it could be 1 or 2 pages. If it's something simple that it doesn't require a lot of instructions and the person who is going to be assigned that work already understands what it is, then the documentation can be even a half page long. The idea is that you have a description, that you know in a sense the instructions that you need in order to build your project. And this is the information that then each team member will use to monitor their own work. They know what to do. They know when they need to do it. They need the resources that are going to be assigned to that, and the people who are going to be contributing to that work. And they use that as their kind of workbook in which they're going to be following their work. Once you do that, once you have the assignment of people, you need to also consider how much work you are assigning to your team. And that's related to the concept of workload. When you are assigning tasks to your team, you have to consider time for these extra events. That means the time your team is going to be on meetings, trainings, collaborating with teammates, and any other assignments. The idea is that you cannot assign somebody 100% of their time in the project to activities in the project. Usually, all of these activities, sometimes, depending on the type of project, they can even go as high as 20%. So make sure that depending on your project, how much time you're going to need to take away from the activities you assign them to your team to the activities they need to do, and they are related even with activities within the project, like meetings and collaboration, which are useful and they are needed. But that means that out of the 8 hours that you have in a day, only maybe 6 hours can be dedicated to actually working on the project. And one of the tools that we use is the resource calendar charts. So for each individual in your team, you can basically have an idea of all the work they have been assigned based on the estimates on the duration of each of activities, and for each month you can identify then what's going to be the total. Eventually you will have that information for the whole year or the duration of your project, and you start adding up all those total numbers, and you're going to be able to identify some that are beyond what is normally physically possible. And that is the usefulness of this chart, is that once you identify those levels, it is important that during that time you don't over allocate the time available to a team member. If we assume that it is about 120 hours per month that you have people working on activities in your project, but somebody's been assigned too many tasks, like 200, then you have a problem. There is no way that physically that person can do that amount of work in that amount of time. Maybe you need to assign somebody else with a couple of activities, split that job, or maybe review some of the estimates that were made on the schedule. Anyway, the idea is that when you over allocate teams to more work, the result is usually that there's going to be poor quality in the outputs of that activity. There's also going to be problems with motivation. There's going to be problems with people not being happy with their jobs, and that brings back some of the initial problems you have when you were building the team. You now have a team that is at a high level of performance, so make sure that you identify that limit and that nobody is beyond that limit or even below that limit. I mean, it's also important to identify that there are certain limits that you need to ask how high this will go to make sure that everybody's allocated and you're using all your resources on the project to the best of their capabilities. Again, these are the tools that you use to manage some of the locations of your team. You're assigning the work to your team members and making sure that they have the skills and they have the time to do the work in the quality that is not only required but is expected.